Hi, my name is Kim. My website is KimberlyKoehler.com, and I am a jewelry and creativity instructor. Today I have a video for you that is kind of a question and answer video about types of wire. I had this question, and so I'm going to answer it, and so let's get started. So I want to start out by saying that I'm going to answer this question by telling you kinds of gauge and what you might use those gauges of wire for. But I think that's something that a lot of people who are just starting to make jewelry and get into wire do is kind of go out and buy everything, and then you have this whole collection of wire that you'll never use. I'm more of a fan of not doing that, kind of seeing what you might need for a project, trying it for a while, and kind of learn what you really truly are going to use. So if you watch my videos, I kind of don't use a whole range of wire. I kind of stick to one wire mostly, and I'll get into that a little bit more. And that's because I have been making jewelry for a while. I know what kind of jewelry I like to make and what I teach you to make, and so I know what I like and I just use that. I will try other things sometimes, and that's a lot of fun too. So my whole goal is to help you learn to make jewelry so that you can express your own creativity and your own style in your jewelry making. I show you tutorials and teach you little tricks, and I also like to give you some creative inspiration, which include prompts and other activities. One of my basic classes, if you're just getting started, is Wire Wrapping for Beginners, and you can find that at wirewrappingforbeginners.com, or you can just click the link below this video, and it really takes you through the basics of wire wrapping. If you're just getting started, you'll learn all kinds of different components, so like head pins and clasps, and even some findings like chain and jump rings. So you are able to make all kinds of different things, and then I show you projects. So you'll take those components, put them together to make the projects. I call these recipes. So maybe you'll need a head pin and a bead and an earring wire to make simple dangle earrings. But then you can really express your creativity by using any of the head pin tutorials that I taught you at the beginning of the class. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, I invite you to come over, check it out over at wirewrappingforbeginners.com. So today I wanted to talk about wire because you may be getting started with the whole wire wrapping thing, and if you're thinking about taking wire wrapping for beginners, then you'll probably want to know, well, what kind of wire do I need? So we're going to get into that today. So the first thing you're going to need to know about is wire gauge, and the gauge is kind of that number you see. So kind of it goes from 10, I think, all the way up to like 32, and that number actually is kind of opposite of what you may think. So the higher the number, the thinner the wire. The other thing you need to know is that gauge is often abbreviated GA. So you may see 20 GA or that sort of thing. So I'm just going to kind of run through the gauges and what you might use each gauge for. 10 or 12 gauge would be kind of the thickest. There may be thicker, but that's as thick as I've seen it. Those gauges are hard to manipulate, and you'll need heavy-duty tools to use those. So you'll need heavy-duty snippers to cut it, or even possibly a jeweler's saw. You will need specialized tools. You can't just use your regular tools to use this thicker gauge. I don't believe I have ever used these gauges, or maybe I have tried it and they're not gauges I use very often. And then there is 14 gauge wire. So 14 gauge is a little bit thinner, but it is still very thick, and it's good for structural support. Things like you might want to make a bezel for resin or something like that. Again, I don't often use 14 gauge wire either. And then we have 16 to 18 gauge, which again is thinner, so I'm going from thickest to thinner. So 16 to 18 gauge wire is kind of where I start using wire. I use 18 gauge all the time. 18 and 16 gauge is great for class. It's also great for structural integrity of your jewelry pieces. So if you're doing wire wrapping, you may need like a more solid base. You might want to use 16 to 18 gauge, and then you use a thinner wire to wrap around, that sort of thing. It's also really good for jump rings and other findings like that. So that brings us to 20 and 22 gauge wire. You will most often hear me use 20 gauge wire. I use it all the time for almost everything. I will go up to 18 gauge for class and things like that, or if I'm making a more complicated piece that needs more structure, I might use 18 gauge, but almost everything I do is 20 gauge. I use that for my wire wrapped rings. I use it for like any kind of chain. Like we learned how to make this necklace. So I'm wearing 3 necklaces, and I did a series on how to make these. This is all 20 gauge wire, all that sorts of thing. I have even used 20 gauge quite often for jump rings and things like that as well. 20 gauge is a great kind of all-purpose gauge of wire to use for most of your wire wrapping needs. So that is where I suggest you start. If you're taking my class Wire Wrapping for Beginners, that is what you will mostly be using in that e-course. And also, it's mostly what I use in these free videos as well, so I think that's a great place to start. I also think 20 gauge is the best wire for earring wires, and you can also make lightweight class with it as well, depending what kind of class you're making and how much kind of wrapping you're doing to make it more structural. 20 gauge will work for that as well. 22 gauge is also great for all those things I already mentioned, and the reason you might want to go to 22 gauge is if you're doing some sort of beading, like you're making a wire wrapped bead link like in my necklace here, and the bead has a smaller hole, then you would use a smaller wire so it can fit through that hole. So that brings us to 24 and 26 gauge wire, and those wires are also great for beads with smaller holes. So kind of all the same things. I wouldn't use it to make anything like clasp or findings or anything like that, but if you're making like wire wrapped bead link or something like that and the hole is smaller, you may want to use 24 to 26 gauge wire. Also, if you're making something that, I don't know, I have some ring tutorials like this or some earring tutorials like this. If you are making kind of a structural piece and then you're kind of wrapping something to it, like oftentimes I'll be taking a bead and adding it to more of a structural piece and doing a lot of wraps with the wire, then your 24 to 26 gauge will be great for that as well. Then we have the very thin wires, which would be 28 to 32, and it is very thin, and I don't use this wire at all, but it's useful for really intricate wire wrapped pieces. If you want to do Viking knit, that's the wire you would use. I personally don't, so if you're looking for that, you'll have to go somewhere else. So it's very thin for very intricate wire wrapping. So that is the gauges of wire. Then wire comes in different shapes. So there's round, square, and half round. The round is kind of, in general, the all-purpose, the wire you're going to use most often. If I'm teaching you a tutorial, it's almost definitely going to be round. And in Wire Wrapping for Beginners, we use round wire for all of that. It's just, in general, what you'll most often use. Square wire is great if you're trying to get like a specific aesthetic look, and it's also good if you're doing something where you're stacking a lot of wires together. They'll very neatly stay together when it's square, like because the edges are all squared off, so they'll easily stack together. And then half round is really good for kind of holding together square wires. So you'll use the kind of flat side of the half round against the square wires, and it's good for kind of banding those wires. There's also fancy or twisted wire, and you can buy it twisted already, or you can actually twist it yourself, and that's really great if you're going for a certain look as well. Remember, if you're twisting it yourself, when you're using the two wires together, the gauge will change, you know, because you're adding the two wires. It's not, if you're putting two 20 gauge wires together, it's going to be thicker than if it was just one 20 gauge wire. Pretty obvious. I just wanted to point that out. So then I also get a question about memory wire often. So memory wire is really great if you want to make bangles or anything that will stay in a loop. It is not for wire wrapping though. So it's not flexible. It's not made to bend and wrap. It will stay in that round state. So it's really great for what I said, bangles, or anytime you need to keep a loop. But anything else it's not. And also you want to use more heavy duty wire cutters with memory wire, because it will kind of nick up and ruin your regular wire cutters. So then the last thing I wanted to talk about was wire hardness. So there is dead soft, half hard, and hard, or I think it's also called full hard. And so almost always I use half hard wire when I'm doing wire wrapping. The other thing is, you won't often see these hardnesses if you're using kind of artistic wire or plated wire. Honestly, I almost always use silver plated wire, so it doesn't actually have a hardness. From what I've used with sterling silver wire, half hard is kind of close to what most artistic wire is. It's a little bit harder than that. Soft wire is a little bit softer. It's kind of in between. So most often I'll just tell you to use half hard wire if you're looking for a hardness. Some of these artistic wires I have found have hardnesses on them as well. And then of course there's all different kinds of metal. So if you're just getting started, I suggest sticking with like a silver plated metal or a copper, and copper is like beautiful, like even beyond just beginning. It's beautiful and it's inexpensive as well. Brass is great, and then of course there's sterling silver and gold filled and all that as well. So I always suggest that even if you are pretty experienced making wire wrap jewelry, if you're just starting to try to make something for the first time, you haven't made this project before, you're not sure how it's going to turn out, you probably didn't want to use your precious metal wire to start with. You'll probably be less frustrated if you start with a less expensive wire to at least try out the project, and then make it in the sterling silver once you have the design down. So that is my suggestion. You can do with it what you want. And then of course I'm asked all the time what wire I use, and so honestly I am very boring with this answer because I basically only use one company, one type of wire. Once I found it, that's basically all I use. I almost never use sterling silver wire, and I almost exclusively only use silver plated wire, occasionally brass or copper, but I use Para-Wire, P-A-R-A wire. They're at parawire.com. I am not paid by them, but I love their wire. And what I like about it is it's tarnish free, it's pretty, it works well for everything that I do. And so that's the other thing I wanted to actually mention now that I think about it. When you're doing wire wrapping and you use, there's all these different kinds of plated wire, and then there's these like real funky, pretty, cool, like colored wires, like it's enameled. Some of that wire does not work well with wire wrapping because as you manipulate the wire, the coating will chip off. And so you have to be careful with that. I don't have that problem at all with Para-Wire. I keep pointing to my ring because I have made this ring with Para-Wire. I've had it for a long time. It's not tarnished. It's not chipped or anything. It looks as beautiful as the day I made it. I highly recommend them if, you know, if you are just getting started and you're not sure where to go. You can just go to craft stores and look for wire there to get started. Parawire is actually less expensive because you can buy more of it and you're buying it directly from the source. It's made in the USA if that's important to you. And they've been in business for a very long time. So I highly recommend Parawire, but you know, you can try other wires from other places as well till you find something that you love. So I hope this was helpful for you. If you have other questions, please let me know. And I hope you'll check out Wire Wrapping for Beginners at wirewrappingforbeginners.com or the link below the video. You can see the entire curriculum there and get a little taste of how the class is set up and decide if it's a good fit for what you want to do. So I hope that was helpful. If you have questions, please let me know and I will try to answer them. And I also actually have a free quick start guide to wire wrap jewelry. So it's an email e-course. It's free. It's 10 days. Each day you get a lesson, something to get you started with wire wrapping. So we start with wire safety, we go through tools, I go into wire in some detail in that course as well, and by the end you'll make a project. So you can give that a little try and kind of see how that goes, and then sign up for Wire Wrapping for Beginners as a continuation. If you do take Wire Wrapping for Beginners, I just give you that quick start guide right at the beginning so you can get started on the right foot. So I hope for you to have a very creative week and really find a way to express your creativity this week.